Hi CC, welcome to week 11 of your timeline. Our first card this week is Norman Conquest and Feudalism in Europe. The Norman Conquest was hugely important in the development of English culture and even the English language, so let's talk about it. Edward the Confessor was King of England, but unfortunately, he died. At the time of his death, 3 separate men all believed they had a legitimate claim to the throne, and they were all willing to back this up with military intervention if necessary. And they all deemed it necessary. I won't go into each of the 3 men, but I'll tell you about the one that matters most, and that's William, Duke of Normandy. But he actually has 3 names in history, at least 3. He's the Duke of Normandy, which means he comes from France, or at least a French-speaking region. You can sort of think of him and his men as French-speaking Vikings. Many of the people of England weren't that crazy about the Duke of Normandy. They saw him as French. Basically, when he came over demanding the throne, it felt like the French were invading them. So they had a different name for William, and I will tell it to you even though it involves a naughty word, because it's historical. They called him William the Bastard. But eventually, because he was triumphant in gaining the throne of England, history came to know him as William the Conqueror. So how did he conquer? In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William's men defeated the English forces. This is the battle that you can see depicted in the very famous Bayeux Tapestry. If you've ever seen weaving on a long piece of fabric and it's knights and people shooting arrows and chainmail, that's the Bayeux Tapestry. After his victory, William set up basically a French-speaking court in England. And suddenly, very nearly overnight, all of the administration, all of the government decisions, all of courtly life was all suddenly French. So there's a huge shift in fashion, culture, preferences, etiquette, and especially language. French floods the English language at this point. And even today, 30% of English words come from French. There are lots of fun references to this period in pop culture. For example, any film depictions you've ever seen of Robin Hood probably include fancy, French-speaking, bad guy noblemen, and they are all the Normans. And they also include hard-working, gruff, oppressed Robin Hood types, and those are basically the Anglo-Saxons, the English. An interesting facet of this French-English divide that historians and linguists like to point out is the way we still have one word for animals and another word for the food that they become. And most of our words for animals, pig, cow, chicken, these all come from Anglo-Saxon. And most of our words for food, poultry, beef, ham, these are all derived from French. So basically, those poor Anglo-Saxons who got defeated are doing all the farming and taking care of the animals, and the fancy French people, the Normans, are doing all the eating of the food. And that's why we have 2 different words. You can still notice this trend today. If you ask yourself to think of words that mean the same thing, and then decide which one of them is the least formal and which one is the most formal, chances are the least formal word comes from English or Anglo-Saxon, and the fancy, eloquent version of the word comes from Norman French. Feudalism was the dominant social system during the Norman Conquest. It was a tiered system of society where many people on the bottom supported fewer people above them, who supported fewer people above them, who all ultimately supported the monarch, the king. This is a crown? I don't know. King? On the very bottom level, we had the serfs or the peasants, and their job was to live on the land, work the farms, produce the food. One step above them were the knights. They're the soldiers of this pyramid scheme. They promised their protection to those peasants and serfs. Above the knights are the lords, and they are doing all the middle management. They're running administration. They're in charge of basically keeping the kingdom running, and they do that by getting everyone beneath them to do whatever they say. Each of these lords has promised military aid to the king, which basically means if the king ever calls on them for aid, those lords have to get their knights to come and fight for them. In some ways, feudalism is a great system. It allows for stability. Everyone knows where they stand. People are protecting each other. The land gets farmed. However, feudalism caused quite a bit of harm due to its rigidity. Eventually, laws were passed so that peasants or serfs, the ones who farmed the land and gave the food to the rest of the pyramid, they weren't allowed to stop being peasants or serfs, even if they had the inclination and the talent or skill to do so. They weren't even allowed to go be peasants or serfs on someone else's land without getting permission from their lord. And if their lord was happy with the way things were already going, they were pretty likely to deny any of those requests. That's where we get this problem that stuck around in English society for so long, that you were sort of stuck where you were born and you cannot rise above your social class. It goes all the way back to feudalism. To create the sign for Norman conquest, we're going to do an ASL N. That's 2 fingers folded over your thumb. N. And that will be Norman. And then for conquest, we've done this before. You take your 2 arms, you sort of cross them down, one on top of the other. So Norman conquest. For feudalism, the common sign used is just building higher and higher. And we just used that for the Heian period in Japan. Why? So we're going to do this hand motion, but I'll ask that we at least scoot over a little bit after each one so that we can see that the pyramid's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, leading to only one person at the top. So altogether, that's Norman conquest and feudalism in Europe. Next up, we have the Crusades. These were a series of holy wars fought by Christians, primarily against Muslims, but not always, in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. So it wasn't just one event, and it went on for hundreds of years. But the most famous crusade, and the one that people sometimes mean when they use the word crusades, is the First Crusade. Basically what happened is the Byzantine emperor was in trouble. He was besieged, and Pope Urban II put out the word to all faithful Catholics, Christians at the time, that they needed to go help preserve the empire. They needed to go defend the emperor. And people responded in droves. Lords were sending their knights. Knights were going on their own. People were heading to the Crusades. In particular, they headed to the Holy Land, and the first major crusade resulted in the city of Jerusalem being taken from the Muslims and put in the hands of the Christians. We call it the Crusades because of the root word crus, or cross. These knights who went on crusade to do battle, they were going with the Pope's permission. They were carrying the cross with them. Some of them were even wearing the cross on their person. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, there is a character who is supposed to be a knight who's been around ever since the Crusades, and that knight is wearing a red cross on his garments. People didn't use the word crusades at first. They said they were going on pilgrimage. People had lots of different reasons for going on pilgrimages or going on the crusades, but it basically boiled down to 3. Fame, money, or forgiveness. The Pope had promised indulgences to many of the people who went on these quests, which means they were given official pieces of paper documenting their forgiveness. It was a paper pass to heaven. To create the sign for the Crusades, we're just going to make a cross, like the one the knights might have worn on their person. And because it was also a battle and there was fighting involved, we're going to start here on our bodies, like it's part of our clothing, and then push it out into battle. So it's the Crusades. Next we have Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa. Zimbabwe is a landlocked country in southern Africa. It's completely surrounded by South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, and Mozambique. And in the 11th century, the Shona people made Zimbabwe a thriving center of trade. Not only was it famous for its very rich trading centers, it was also famous for its use of dry stone architecture. Just picture a typical cartoon stone building or even a brick wall. What do you imagine? Most of us would imagine a brick or stone surrounded by some kind of mortar to help the stones stick together, the sticky stuff. But in dry stone architecture, there is no sticky stuff. The stones are just fitted so perfectly and so tightly that they stay together on their own. It's a very impressive building technique, and some of these towers of Zimbabwe still survive today. In fact, the name Zimbabwe comes from words for houses of stone or walls of stone. So when we do the sign for Zimbabwe, we're going to make a little wall and just spread it across a wide area. Zimbabwe. Mali is a famous region that developed around this same time in Western Africa. In fact, at its peak, it was the largest kingdom in all of West Africa. Mali was such a successful trading center, and its king was so wealthy that at one point he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He spent so much gold on his trip that it caused inflation all the way back in Egypt. That's a lot of gold. To create the sign for Mali, we're going to do an ASL M, which is 3 fingers over your thumb. Kind of hard for me at this twisted angle to do this correctly, but I think you get the idea. 3 fingers folded over your thumb is an M for Mali. For Africa, we're not going to do this gold sign again, even though CC keeps pushing it. We're going to just do the ASL for Africa. Now, I've taught you in the past that you can do the sign for Africa by just tracing the shape of Africa in the air in front of you. However, there is a slight variation on that where you bring the sign a little bit closer to your face and sign Africa over your face. And that is so close to the sign for beautiful that people say that sign means beautiful Africa. So let's try it like this. Africa. Altogether, the signs for this card are Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa. Next we have Aztecs of Mesoamerica, and as we've discussed in the past, Mesoamerica was basically central Mexico and all the regions surrounding it, and Lake Texcoco, which is the best name for a lake ever. 3 major city-states banded together to form the Aztec Empire. It would take entire videos to describe each of those city-states and their founding stories and their complex cultures, but I'll hit just the most basic points of the Aztec Empire. It was known for its wealth, its trade, and its religion, and for the giant pyramids it built in service of that religion. But more on that later. The Aztec Empire thrived for hundreds of years. It lasted all the way until the reign of Montezuma, or Moctezuma, who you may have heard of. Montezuma ruled the Aztec Empire during the arrival of Hernan Cortez, a Spanish conquistador. Cortez brought Catholicism in, and he took the Aztec Empire out. One of the most notable aspects of Aztec culture was its emphasis on religious human sacrifices. Now, it's entirely possible that the numbers have been inflated, and of course there are nuances of culture and mythology that we can't understand now that would have been in place back then. But the plain fact of the matter is that this culture believed in killing people to appease its gods. One estimate is that between 10,000 and 80,400 people were sacrificed in only 4 days. This was in the week that the most famous Aztec pyramid was dedicated. In my opinion, modern historians make too little of this human sacrifice aspect of Aztec culture. It's almost like they're trying to hide it. If you try to look up Aztec rituals, you'll find a list that says, there was food, storytelling, there was some dancing, they played a ball game, and also human sacrifice. To create the sign, I've seen lots of people just do a pyramid, like this. The big problem with that is that it doesn't accurately reflect Aztec pyramids. The Aztec built twin pyramids side by side, rising up together, and there were large staircases going down both pyramids. So I'm going to suggest that we do a sign that indicates those 2 pyramids rising up beside one another. It would look a bit like this. Take your fingers, spread them out, and draw them close together to build 2 pyramids. Aztecs of Mesoamerica. And then I'd like to do one more thing, just to remember how horrible this human sacrifice was. Let's take our hands and bind them together like a prisoner, and let's draw them down the center of that pyramid. So then we have Aztecs of Mesoamerica. Next, we have Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas, 2 beautifully influential Catholic friars. Francis of Assisi was born incredibly wealthy in the town of Assisi. His mother was a noblewoman, and his father was a very successful cloth merchant. But one day, as the story goes, Francis was working in the marketplace selling cloth for his dad, like you do, when a poor beggar came up to Francis and begged him for alms. Francis's heart broke for this poor man, and as soon as he had finished making the sale of all the cloth, he ran after the man and gave him all the money he had. Francis's father was furious, and this was a pattern that was to repeat itself throughout Francis's life. St. Francis had lots of earthly adventures before becoming a saint. He was a soldier, he was captured and was a prisoner of war for an entire year. He had friends who loved to carouse with him and get wild in town, but he kept getting these visions of things he was supposed to do. He felt the Spirit of God calling him to come repair the church that had fallen down. He did this quite literally by walking around town begging for stones and then carrying them stone by stone himself to the buildings and putting them in place and rebuilding them. He rebuilt several crumbling chapels that way. In the midst of all his earthly wealth, Francis's mind had started to turn to this vow of poverty. At one point, a friend asked him, "Hey Francis, are you thinking of getting married?" And he said, "Yes, to a fairer bride than any of you have ever seen." And by that he meant Lady Poverty. So Francis felt this call on his life to get rid of wealth, to share what he had with the poor. But in order to do that, he kept giving away his father's money. His father at one point had him beaten, tied up, imprisoned in a tower. His mother eventually set him free, and eventually took him to court to declare that he could no longer have access to his inheritance. But Francis said, "That's okay, I don't want it," and he sort of rejected the inheritance himself. He took on this vow of poverty and eventually founded his own order, the Franciscan Friars. And they're the sort of picture of a sweet friar that you might have in your mind from books or films. The Franciscans are the ones in plain brown robes with a rope tied around their belts. The rope might have 3 knots in it to remind the wearer of the 3 vows that Franciscans take: purity, chastity, and obedience. Francis did so much in his life. Not only did he found the Franciscan order, which involved banding people together, going to the Pope, asking permission, he also founded the Women's Order of St. Clare. Many popes choose to take on the name Francis in honor of him. The city of San Francisco is named after him, and he's been officially declared a saint. One of the things for which he's most remembered is his love for animals, and he's still considered the patron saint of animals. There's one story that a wolf had been terrorizing a town, and Francis went into the mountains and found the wolf and brought him back to the town and said, "Look, town, this wolf was only hurting you because he was hungry. Now you feed the wolf, and then he won't hurt you anymore." Another story says that as he was walking along, he saw a tree filled with birds, and he told his companions, "Wait here while I go and preach to my sisters, the birds." And he went and stood by the tree and shared the gospel with this tree full of birds, and they flew all around him and landed on him, and none of them flew away. Many churches host an annual blessing of the animals on the day of St. Francis's feast day, which is October 4th, and we can thank St. Francis for making the first live animal nativity. Now, while St. Francis was a Franciscan, St. Aquinas was a Dominican. They're known as the Order of Preachers, but some people think they should also be called the Order of Teachers, since so many Dominicans are involved in the founding of universities, and so many of them are incredibly influential instructors. Aquinas famously believed in natural theology. That is, he didn't believe that God was in conflict with reason, or that God was in conflict with science and rationality. In fact, he believed all reason came from God. That led him to attempt to reconcile great thinkers like Aristotle with the Christian faith. Some people loved him for this, and some people disliked him for it. Aquinas knew that he wanted to join the Dominican order when he was 19 years old, but his family fiercely opposed this decision. At one point, he was on his way to join the order, stopped to take a drink by a spring, and his brothers kidnapped him. They took him back home, where he was imprisoned for almost a year. His family tried everything they could think of to turn him away from this religious calling of his. They even hired a woman to seduce Aquinas. He chased her away with a flaming log and then used the log to put a cross on the wall. From that point on, he took a lifelong vow of chastity. Aquinas eventually went on to become highly educated. He became a theological advisor to the Pope himself. He became the head of schools for the Catholic Church. He wrote a great theological work called the Summa Theologiae, where he tried to discuss everything there was to know about theology. He could reportedly teach all subjects, and today there are still universities that were founded in his name. And he spent his entire life preaching with depth and thoughtfulness and reason to anyone who would listen. One weird legend that gets passed around about him is that he would get so deep into his thoughts and have such deep, vivid visions of God that he would levitate off the ground. You'll remember last week we did the sign for the Great Schism. Well, 200 years after that schism, in the time when Aquinas lived, people were still trying to get the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Orthodox Church to get back together. And while Aquinas was on his way to a meeting hoping to accomplish just that, he injured his head, fell ill, and died. At the time of his death, he was still a controversial figure, with some people saying, how dare he try to use all that worldly reason. But in Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante makes him one of the souls in heaven. 50 years after his death, he was declared a saint. To create the sign for Francis of Assisi, we're going to do an ASL F, but we want to remember all those beautiful animal stories about Francis and the simple life he lived. So let's take our F and then blink it away like a bird flying away from a branch. So, Francis of Assisi. For Thomas Aquinas, let's make an ASL T. That's like this, with your thumb poking through. And then let's turn it into a pen and use it to write some great theology. So, Thomas Aquinas. Altogether, that's Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas. Next we have Japan's shoguns. The shoguns are rulers. They're officially appointed by the Emperor of Japan. But because they were the ones making all of the decisions on the ground, and they were the ones wielding all the power, they eventually became dictators. While at first every shogun was appointed by the emperor, eventually the title became hereditary. It was just passed on to the children in each line. The shoguns ruled Japan for 700 years. And part of how they did that is that they were in charge of the military and these great Japanese soldiers known as the samurai. One of the big symbols of the shoguns is a tent or a curtain, and the idea here was that their tent would be pitched in the middle of a battle, and people would come to them and sit at the open door of this tent and be given advice and orders and decisions. The term shogun isn't really in use anymore. However, in World War II, when General Douglas MacArthur was basically in charge of Japan for an extended period, they did refer to him as a shogun. And even now, when a political figure supposedly retires, for example, they're serving as prime minister and then they step out of the political sphere, but they're still kind of secretly influencing things underground, someone like that is called a shadow shogun. To create this sign, we're going to draw a samurai sword or a katana out of its scabbard. And if you want to be a nerd about it, there is a special technique to this. You reach for the scabbard and pull the sword out, but while you're doing that, you actually have to draw the scabbard back. You're not going to be able to see it unless I do it sort of up high, but basically it looks like this. Whew. So you've got a sword coming out and the scabbard being pulled back at the same time. So we'll have Japan's shoguns. Our last card for this week is Incas of South America. The Incas are the very last of a series of cultures that thrived in the Andes Mountains of Peru for thousands of years. In fact, some historians think of it as a pristine culture, which means it doesn't have any notable outside influences that ever came in and changed it. It just grew up in that region of the world and stayed untainted by the rest of the world. The most prominent city of the Incas is Cusco, which you might remember from the film The Emperor's New Groove. And that entire film, of course, is based off of Incan culture. Although we think of the Incas as being Peruvian or in Peru, the actual Incan Empire stretched much further than that. It included, I have to read the list, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Colombia, and Chile. It was a huge empire. The Incas created thousands of miles of roads. Along with that, they created great, impressive stone monuments. They did all of this without many of the things that we consider markers of advanced civilization. They, as far as we know, had never discovered the wheel. They didn't know how to make iron or steel. They didn't even have pack animals like horses or oxen to pull things for them. The biggest animals they have are llamas. They also did all of this basically without money. From what we can tell, everything in the Incan civilization was handled through trade, through bartering, or through just obeying the commands of the Sun King. The basic tools of their civilization were freeze-dried potatoes and llamas, and their basic weapon of choice is a bunch of stones tied together. And yet, given all that, and the fact this civilization was formed in a highly mountainous, cold region, there's a reason those were freeze-dried potatoes, the Incas thrived. They did this for thousands of years until, just like the Aztecs of Mesoamerica, the Incas of South America were defeated by Spanish conquistadors. To create the sign for the Incas, we're just going to show a big mountain range, the Andes Mountains. So we'll do this. Incas of South America. That's it. Ready to see it all put together? 3, 2, 1, go!
Norman Conquest and Feudalism in Europe. The Crusades in Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa. Aztecs of Mesoamerica. Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas. Grand Shoguns, Incas of South America.
Okay, here we go. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, timeline. We'll start at the beginning of the ages. Age of ancient empires. Creation to circa 450 AD. Creation and the fall. The flood and the Tower of Babel. Mesopotamia and Sumer Egyptians. 3000 BC, 3000 BC. Indus River Valley Civilization, Minoans and Mycenaeans. 7 wonders of the ancient world. Patriarchs of Israel. 2000 BC, 2000 BC. Hittites and Canaanites, Cush, Assyrians, world divides into two kingdoms, Homer and Hesiod. Rome founded by Romulus and Remus. Israel falls to Assyria, Assyria falls to Babylon. Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha. Judah falls to Babylon, temple destroyed. Babylon falls to Persia, Jews return and rebuild the temple. Roman Republic, Golden Age of Greece, Peloponnesian Wars. Persia falls to Alexander the Great. India's Mauryan Empire, Mayans of Mesoamerica, Punic Wars, Rome conquers Greece. Roman dictator Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus and the Pax Romana. John the Baptist, Jesus the Messiah. Year 1 AD, year 1 AD, year 1 AD. Pentecost and the early church. Persecution spreads the gospel. Herod's temple destroyed by Titus. Diocletian divides the Roman Empire. Constantine legalizes Christianity. India's Gupta dynasty. Council of Nicaea, Augustine of Hippo. Jerome completes the Vulgate. Visigoths at Rome. The Middle Ages, circa 450 to circa 1500. Council of Chalcedon, Western Roman Empire falls to barbarians.
500 AD, 500 AD.
Once is enough. Ah!
Byzantine Emperor Justinian.
Benedict and monasticism. Mohammed founds Islam.
Clans in early Ghana in Africa. Franks defeat Muslims at the Battle of Tours.
Golden Age of Islam. Ooh.
Vikings raid and trade. Japan's Imperial.
Charlemagne crowned Emperor of Europe. Alfred the Great of England.
Eric the Red and Leif Erikson.
Norse explorers. Vladimir the First of Kiev.
Byzantine Emperor
Basil the Second. 1000 AD, 1000 AD. East-West schism of the church. Norman conquest and feudalism in Europe. The Crusades in Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa. Aztecs of Mesoamerica, Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas, Japan's Shoguns, Incas of South America. Genghis Khan rules the Mongols. England's Magna Carta. Ottoman Empire, Marco Polo's journey to China, the 100 Years' War and Black Death, the Renaissance, China's Ming Dynasty. Age of exploration, circa 1400 to circa 1600. Prince Henry founds School of Navigation, slave trade in Africa. Gutenberg's printing press, Songhai in Africa. Tsar Ivan the Great of Russia,
to circa 1800.
Protestant Reformation, Spanish conquistadors in the Americas, Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Council of Trent, the Baroque period of the arts, Japan's isolation, Jamestown and Plymouth colony founded, Age of Enlightenment, circa 1650 to circa 1800, Hudson's Bay Company, First Great Awakening, classical period of the arts, the 7 Years' War. Age of Industry, circa 1760 to circa 1969. James Cook sails to Australia and Antarctica. American Revolution and General George Washington. Madison's Constitution and the Bill of Rights. French Revolution, Second Great Awakening. Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark Expedition. Napoleon crowned Emperor of France. Liberation of South America. The War of 1812, the Missouri Compromise. Immigrants flock to America. The Monroe Doctrine, romantic period of the arts. Cherokee Trail of Tears, U.S. westward expansion.
Marx publishes the Communist Manifesto.
The Compromise of 1850 and the Dred Scott Decision. U.S. restores trade with Japan. British Queen Victoria's rule over India. Darwin publishes
The Origin of Species.
Lincoln's War between the states, reconstruction of the southern states, dominion of Canada. Otto von Bismarck unifies Germany. Wars in Africa, the Spanish-American War. The Progressive Era, Australia becomes a commonwealth. Mexican Revolution, World War I and President Wilson. Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. U.S. evangelist Billy Graham. Modern period of the arts. The Great Depression and the New Deal. World War II and President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Stalin of the USSR and the Katyn Massacre.
The United Nations formed. The Cold War. Gandhi and India's independence. Jewish state established. Mao and communist victory in China. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Korean War.
Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement.
Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, missionaries to Ecuador, the Antarctic Treaty, the Vietnam War. U.S. astronauts walk on the moon.
On the LNP. Yeah.
Age of information and globalization, circa 1970 to the present. Watergate, President Nixon resigned.
Au revoir.
Fall of communism in Eastern Europe. European Union formed. Apartheid abolished in South Africa. 2000 AD, 2000 AD, September 11th, 2001.
Our fellow citizens are waiting.
Rising tide of freedom, rising tide